Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG Public Media, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Hello and welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Anthony Moreno. In a moment, we'll have a look back at how bills related to the oil and gas industry in the state did in the recent New Mexico legislative session. But first, we kick off the show with an up-close look at an area guitar maker and bladesman who crafts guitars for some well-known musicians. Producer David Vasquez III has more on this Living Here.
I grew up in Montana, and my dad was a fighter pilot. So he was gone a lot, and so I would stay at my granddad's place, and that was a ranch. Anything you needed, you just made it. And so I started making stuff real early, but while I was going to school, I was a framing carpenter. That actually gives you a lot of freedom because you could go to any part of the country that you're interested in, and the next day you can have a job if you want it. But whenever I was somewhere, I would look up other people that were making knives or building guitars or just going and listening to music, and seeing what people are playing. And all that stuff started in college. Went on from there. I've done both of those things most of my life. So I've been playing, I've built amplifiers too. These things over here are things I've built. And I'd get an old one that's in bad shape and build a better cabinet, and you realize the materials you build the cabinet out of all have a play in the sound also. And these old potato sacks, they work great as the grill cloth covers. This little guy here, this is an aluminum body. This is a little pan there's a resonator down here, and that's what amplifies the sound. But I don't spend a lot of time on fancy inlay or any of that stuff because that just raises the price for really no reason as far as I'm concerned, because I look at the thing as a tool, because I'm building for musicians, not for collectors. I know that, playability is more important than the way it looks. Knives are a lot less complicated. The design is dictated by what you're going to use it for. You've got 2 or 3 standard shaped kitchen knives and really about that many hunting knives. Just a general use one, or if you can get more specialized if you want, but it doesn't have to be a big knife. So this one, I use nickel and iron on each side just as a decoration really. And on the cutting edge is 2 different kinds of tool steel. And this one, I ran that steel up and down like that. This I made kind of the same way. It's got the nickel and iron. This is fairly stain resistant. And then there's the same thing. I've got this Damascus that's a high carbon Damascus that makes the cutting edge. And then this is some of that Mokame on the guard. I tried different ways of tempering. You don't want to cool them too fast because, you hear a little tink and that's a crack in the blade. Just throw it away. And really a kitchen oven for simple tool steel works just fine because your tempering temperatures are about 400 degrees. And so I'll temper knives and bake bread at the same time.
New Mexico's 60-day legislative session ended in March, and a number of bills related to the regulation of the oil and gas industry in the state failed to pass through the legislature. Joining us now to offer some analysis on what issues some lawmakers attempted to tackle is investigative journalist Jerry Redfern, who covers the oil and gas industry in New Mexico for Capital and Maine. Jerry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks as always for having me on, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure to talk to you to get some insight on the oil and gas industry and the reporting that you're doing. I'd like to start off with the legislative session. You wrote in your recent story about what happened in the session that it was business as usual. Why do you feel it was that way?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a snarky headline, I guess, but what happened was actually very little. There were many bills that were proposed, that were debated, and almost none of them passed. And in fact, very few of them even had much of a hearing or didn't get beyond their first hearings. So it was, very little was accomplished in that particular side.
You've been reporting on a number of issues facing the oil and gas industry, especially when it comes to the regulation of the industry. Let's start off with some of the efforts that lawmakers attempted to address, and that is keeping new wells away from schools. Can you share a little bit about that effort and what it entailed?
Yeah, there was supposed to be that the hope was to create a setback rule so that no new oil and gas facilities, not just wells, but any type of oil and gas facility couldn't be sited within a mile radius of any school or school grounds. Oil wells and these facilities like tank farms or processing facilities do have a tendency to leak, and they leak gases that are without question harmful to health. So the thought was, back them off from schools at the very least, because kids are young and young people are still growing their bodies. They're still growing their defenses to things like air pollution. This is the second time a bill like this has come up and has been shot down. It was sort of fought again tooth and nail by the oil and gas industry. It was a little surprising to me, honestly, because I don't know that there are all that many schools left in the state that don't already have. If they're going to put wells or facilities like that within a mile of school, I think that's already been done, but they still fought this, to the bitter end.
Interesting. Now, do you think there's going to be any further efforts to address this issue in future legislative sessions or perhaps in the interim?
Oh, I think anybody trying to prognosticate what's going to happen in the next legislative session is a sort of a fool's game. But I will say that the next legislative session is one of our 1-month sessions that's devoted almost exclusively to budget matters. And the only way issues like this could come up that aren't directly related to budget matters is if the governor asks specifically the legislature to cover it. I will throw out there, too, that next year, yeah. Next year we're going to have another governor's election, and for I think it's 40 years now, every time that the state of New Mexico has chosen a new governor, they've chosen a governor from the opposing party. So the likelihood of this kind of legislation passing under a Republican governor, if that were to happen, I think is also fairly slim.
I see. Now, one of the efforts that lawmakers attempted to address was also the royalty rate increase. Can you share with us a little bit about that legislation and attempt, and just where New Mexico is really at with that compared to perhaps other big oil-producing states?
Right. So this was one of the things that did pass in this particular legislative session, and it's a very particular royalty rate increase that, I now forget off the top of my head. It raises the royalty rates on new land leases on state land in particular parts of the Permian Basin down south by a couple of percent. And it doesn't sound like a very lot, but this is some of the most productive oil producing land in the United States. So it would bring in several $1 million in extra revenue to the state when these leases are finally sold and oil's being produced on them. An awful lot of the lobbying side of things, from New Mexico Oil and Gas Association to Permian Petroleum Association to New Mexico independent producers, they all fought against this. But it was interesting, in one of the last debates that they had, in one of the committee meetings, it was EOG, which is the largest producer in the state, based out of Houston. They called in and in testimony in this committee meeting saying, we don't have a problem with that. That's perfectly fine. And then eventually that bill did pass. So that should be going into effect later this year, I guess.
Now, compared to other states with royalty rates, how does New Mexico really fall in with other big oil-producing states?
Yeah, that depends upon how you want to go about calculating the royalty rates. If you were in favor of this particular royalty rate going through, you would be arguing that, let me back up quickly. There are several different types of royalties that are charged on oil and gas produced in the state, from local to state to federal, based on this, based on that, based on different levels of different production levels, which is, point being how you want to sort of slice and dice that. Either we are under what's happening over in Texas on these royalty rate issues, or we're taxing producers here a great deal more than happens in Texas and or Colorado or places like that. So I think just me speaking off the top of my head, I got a funny feeling we're maybe toward the upper end of the range, but I don't think it's necessarily the most. But, obviously if you have people like EOG calling in and saying we got no problem with it, I don't think it's overly onerous, but what do I know?
I see. I want to move on and talk about another issue that concerns some folks, and that has to do with the enforcement of pipeline safety. Can you share with us a little bit about what you found on your reporting with this issue and efforts that were made to address it?
Right. There was a bill that did pass that's sort of increased the penalty amounts on pipeline violations in the state to match what the federal regulations are. The thought from the fiscal impact report that the state's economists do on this particular bill was that it might bring in a couple $1,000 extra a year. It was less based on the idea of enforcement and more based on the idea of raising the penalties for when people are found to be violating the laws as they exist. So I think in the greater scheme of things, it's a fairly minor thing, but it did pass as well.
There's also some concern about just kind of the lack of oversight with the people or companies that were producing new wells and the history that some of them may have had with prior violations when it comes to the oil and gas industry. Can you kind of shine some light on just what's going on there?
Yeah, this has been an issue that's been brought up for the last several years. Generally, it's referred to as a bad actors bill. There are companies that are, or I should say people, generally speaking, that sort of serially start up small companies that buy up low, underperforming wells that larger companies are trying to dump and get off their books so that, they keep their profit margins higher, they keep their production numbers higher. So these folks will buy these low-producing wells, sort of run them for as long as they can with as little maintenance as they can get away with, and then declare bankruptcy, saying we don't have the money to plug and remediate these wells. And this bill from the last few sessions now has been trying to sort of, plug that hole in the leasing and licensing system at the Oil Conservation Division. And it should be noted that the Oil Conservation Division was one of the strongest backers of this because they're the state agency that has to deal with this when it happens. They have to go out and monitor these things. They have to go out and decide that the company's truly gone bankrupt and there are no funds there to go after. They're the ones who have to contract with plugging companies to plug and then remediate these wells if they've been abandoned. And that's very expensive. It takes a lot of time. And they've been seeing a lot of this over the years and are trying to keep that from happening in the first place.
So with that division being tasked with addressing that issue, how is the division really doing in addressing the issue? I know there's been some challenges with staffing a lot of folks at these state agencies charged with oversight. So how is that happening within that division?
they're stretched. I don't think there's any real question about that, and I think they admit this themselves. They There was an interesting committee meeting, one of the interim session committee meetings that happened last November before the full legislative session began. And the new head of the Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, Melanie Kenderdine, who's sort of the overall boss, the Oil Conservation Division is under that department, under her purview. And she got up in front of a committee and said that, we're number 2 in oil production, we're number 4 or 5 in natural gas production, and we're 9th in terms of the staff that we have to monitor these sorts of things. And she was essentially asking the committee to set aside more money to hire more people to be able to do more enforcement work and keep track of stuff that goes on in the oil field. And in the end, that didn't happen in this last legislative session. So getting back to your question about looking for orphan wells, that takes things like lawyers, that takes things like people on the ground to notice these wells, that takes people sitting in offices and watching production numbers. It takes people to be able to put all of these different bits together to be able to get to the point where you can determine that a well has been abandoned and then the state needs to pick it up. And then you begin the whole next process of the actual contracting with a company to close it down at significant cost.
So as it stands right now, were there any steps taken during the legislative session to actually improve or strengthen enforcement on companies that may be risky or bad actors in the industry?
I don't think so. I think that no, that once again was sort of seen by the industry as it would keep small operators out of the game, and that's been sort of the biggest argument from session to session to session, is we have to protect small local operators from overreaching government keeping us from being able to do business. I
see. I want to move on and talk about some climate concerns and, of course, environmental concerns that you've done a lot of reporting on over in recent years, and that has to do with codifying the methane rule in New Mexico. Can you share with us an update on that?
Yeah, it didn't happen. Really straightforward. This is, again, been brought up a couple of times. This was one of the first issues that Governor Lujan Grisham brought up when she came into office, that she wanted to dramatically reduce the amount of methane being released. It's, a primary driver of climate change, of climate warming, or, our atmosphere warming. And it didn't pass. It's as simple as that. And it in the greater scheme of things, didn't even get very far in committee hearings.
What was the take from lawmakers on this issue? I know you talk with people on both sides of the aisle with your reporting. So what are you hearing from lawmakers on why that issue stalled in the legislature?
Well, there's what they say up front, and then there's what they say when they ask not to be quoted for these sorts of things. And what they say up front is that, the bill just wasn't quite ready to be passed yet. On the sort of more environmental side, that's the general answer. On the more conservative Republican, but not always. I mean, a lot of Democrats were not in favor of this either. The concern is that it's going to affect production in New Mexico and cause revenues to the state to drop, although there isn't any particular indication that that would necessarily happen. I mean, to put the whole story in perspective, the state does have some of the most stringent methane rules in the country. And since implementing them 2-3 years ago, production hasn't dropped. It hasn't had any noticeable effect on the state bringing in revenue. We've had record revenue years, year after year after year. So I'm not sure that's exactly what's going on there. I think a lot of the fight on the Democratic side is worry, as I was just talking about, that it might affect revenues, but they're not seeing the greater picture perhaps. And I think from Republicans, they kind of fight everything on the oil and gas side because you got to fight everything that comes up against oil and gas. It's just like a reflex.
You mentioned the greater picture. What is the greater picture when we're talking about that issue?
Okay, well, let's talk about today, like right now. Oil is currently trading just below $60 a barrel, which many say is actually the break-even point for people drilling new wells in the Permian Basin, be it in Texas or New Mexico. So it's now theoretically trading below that break-even point. That has happened not because of any taxes that were put in place. That's not happened because of any new regulations that were put in place. None of that. That's happened because oil is a commodity. And the President of the United States has said he's going to impose a whole bunch of trade tariffs. This might not seem like it's part of the whole same deal, but it is. People are seeing down the line that if the economy shrinks, what happens invariably when the economy shrinks is people buy less oil and gas. So the price is dropping now because people are looking down the line, seeing that the economy is likely going to shrink, which has nothing to do with what happened in the legislature that just ended. So that's the bigger picture here. It's trying to remember that oil and gas are both commodities that have many much larger influences on them in terms of their price than what happens, generally speaking, at the New Mexico legislature.
With a new administration in Washington coming to office this year in January, President Trump has been very vocal about his efforts to deregulate the industry. How do you see that playing a role in impacting New Mexico, or have you seen anything so far that perhaps has, besides the tariffs?
So far, not yet, because the various rules that they're looking to cut have not yet officially been severed. I think we're going to start seeing it later this year, possibly as early as this summer, but it's going to be in subtle ways, I think. You're going to have fewer EPA people out in the field, fewer EPA people doing enforcement. You're going to have fewer people with the EPA and Department of Interior / BLM doing the background checks on things, doing the paperwork to get new leases out the door, theoretically. These are all theory because we don't know because they haven't happened yet, but these are things that have been promised. And what that will likely lead to, if you have fewer people doing enforcement, is a likely increase in pollution in terms of spills both on the ground and then things going up into the air.
Now, it certainly may be concerning for some folks who live in the oil and gas parts of New Mexico where oil and gas is being extracted. You've done a lot of reporting in these areas, especially in the southeastern part of the state. Can you share with us a little bit about what you've seen on the ground, talking with people who are voicing their concerns about how the pollution in those areas may be impacting them and their health?
Yeah, I should say I haven't been down there since the end of the session, but before that, toward the end of last year, I was down there a fair bit. And the biggest issue was air pollution, because a series of studies have come out showing that air pollution in the Permian Basin in New Mexico is really pretty extreme. Basically speaking, the air down there is bad for your health. And in certain places, it's really bad for your health. Many of the byproducts that come out of the ground, we all like the gas that goes into the car, the natural gas that heats the homes. I think we can all understand that, but it comes with a lot of extra stuff that comes up out of the ground that has to be dealt with. And everybody down there is very concerned about that. You can see it in the air on the really bad days, the haze, the ozone that blocks in the sky. So I think that will continue to be a concern, and probably a growing concern, if you have less enforcement. Another interesting thing that's happened just in the last few days is there was a small series of very noticeable earthquakes just on the Texas side of the border. And that's almost, 99% sure that's due to reinjection of produced water, which people might have heard about as well, which is the naturally occurring brackish, briny water that comes up in oil production. And it's totally a waste. You can't really do much of anything with it. So people re-inject it. Along the border, New Mexico has shut down its injection wells because of this risk, but they're still injecting on the Texas side, and we're continuing to have earthquakes because of that. So that's another thing that could.
I see. Yeah.
That's another thing to keep an eye on going forward.
Yeah, we've done some reporting on that, and people can learn more about that at our website, krwg.org. Just look for the shaky ground section to learn more about that. And that's also been the big talk in our part of New Mexico in recent days with that recent one that was felt in our area. I want to talk about some challenges facing the State Environment Department. You've certainly reported a lot on this issue. Can you kind of share with us an update on just where you think that's going to go as we move towards a gubernatorial election?
Once again, it's like trying to guess what's going to happen in the legislature. I'm not entirely sure. The Environment Department Secretary James Kenney has really tried to change a lot at the Environment Department since he came into office at roughly the same time that Governor Lujan Grisham did. The latest thing is a restructuring of many of the departments to create a totally separate enforcement department within the Environment Department. Previously, enforcement actions were undertaken by all the same individual departments that were also doing the licensing, and many people thought that presented an apparent conflict of interest, and the thought was to try to get rid of that and consolidate the enforcement activities across all the different parts of the Environment Department. Okay, so there's that. The other thing is he's been constantly asking for more money to fund all the various things that the Environment Department continues to have added to its plate that it's supposed to be doing, year after year going forward. And he's constantly been butting heads with people at the finance committees at the legislature about, well, we keep giving you raises and you keep coming back and asking for more and more money. But at the same time, he keeps being given more and more to do. They make the argument, well, you should start figuring out how to do more with less because we keep giving you more than we give everybody else. And it's been a long, drawn out, years long fight back and forth between mostly James Kenney and Senator Munoz, who's the head of the Senate Finance Committee, on how much money the Environment Department should get. I'll just throw in the last note that the Environment Department's budget was absolutely slashed under the previous administration of Susana Martinez, and that's a big argument that's been used for these many years by Kenney to try to get more money. Right, rambling there.
No, thank you for sharing. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Jerry Redfern is an investigative journalist with Capital and Maine covering the oil and gas industry in New Mexico. Jerry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Anthony. It's been great.
And we want to thank you for joining us for this week's episode. Remember, you can always keep updated with news anytime at krwg.org. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.